A poor young repairman agrees to repair an old widow's dilapidated house for free, knowing she cannot pay him. He works for 2 weeks, unaware that this decision will change his life forever. 3 months later, a mysterious letter from his lawyer shocked him when he learned about the old woman's last will. The gift she left made him cry and realize the magical power of unconditional kindness. But what was that gift, and why did a stranger give him everything? Welcome to Kindness Stories, where stories of kindness and goodness are told in the most sincere way. Sometimes, a small act can create a greater miracle than you think. Today, let's explore the story of a poor repairman and the unexpected gift that made him cry. Ethan Carter lives in a small suburban town in the mid-Atlantic United States. He is a skilled repairman, but the work is unstable. On good days, Ethan makes enough to pay for electricity, water, and a few hot meals. On other days, he struggles to make ends meet. At 29, Ethan lives alone in an old rental house with basic furniture and a used pickup truck. That morning, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, watching the bills pile up. He took a sip of cold coffee and sighed when the phone rang. On the other end was Mr. Howard, the owner of the local hardware store. "Hi, Ethan. I have the contact number of an old lady who needs some repairs done on her house. I hear her house is in a terrible state. Why don't you come and see what we can do?" Ethan hesitated, thinking of declining because his schedule was full and he was tired. But hearing Mr. Howard's urgent voice, he decided to give it a try. Rose Harding's house was at the end of a deserted street, its roof tilted and its walls cracked. Rose, an old woman in her 70s, was thin, but her eyes were still bright with love. When she opened the door and saw Ethan, she smiled, her hands shaking as if by habit. "You're Ethan, right? You're here, how lucky." Her voice was as soft as a breeze, but Ethan could hear the loneliness in every word. He entered the house and quickly realized the terrible condition of the place. The roof was leaking, the wooden floors were rotten, the pipes were leaking everywhere. When Ethan gave a rough estimate, Rose lowered her head, her voice choked. "I know it will cost a lot, but honey, I don't have the money to pay." Ethan stood still, looking at Rose's thin shoulders and suddenly thinking of his mother, the woman who had worked hard to raise him and had also passed away in a house that was not much better. He couldn't bear to turn away. "Don't worry, I'll fix it for free." "I can do it for you." Mrs. Rose looked up, her eyes filled with tears. Ethan stood still, looking at the glass of water. "Thank you, Ethan. You're a good boy." The next day, Ethan began his work on Mrs. Rose's old house. He brought his familiar toolbox and set to work with great determination. The sound of hammering and sawing echoed in the house that had been silent for too long. He sat down to light his cigarettes and preemptively set the tools on the workstation. Mrs. Rose, despite her old age and frail health, still tried to bring Ethan a cup of hot tea every morning and a buttered toast every afternoon. He watched her stooping over a small wooden tray, his heart filled with sympathy. She was sitting at her desk when Mrs. Rose came in. A second patrol car entered. Ethan was all about work at first, but as the days went on, he and Rose began to talk more. While she was fixing a rotten floorboard, she told him about her past. "My husband died 10 years ago. Since then, I've been the only one in this house. I had a son, but..." She paused, her eyes distant. "He died when he was very young." Ethan couldn't say anything but stay silent and listen. He could feel her pain, a pain that never seemed to go away. Her stories reminded Ethan of his mother, who had raised him alone and died in poverty. Ethan worked harder in the following days. He fixed the leaky roof, replaced rusty pipes, and painted peeling walls. Although the work was tiring and sometimes required borrowing materials, every time he saw Mrs. Rose sitting on the wooden chair, smiling with satisfaction, Ethan felt like he was doing the right thing in his life. One afternoon, as Ethan was putting the last shingles on the roof, Mrs. Rose called him down. She placed a freshly baked apple pie in front of him and said, "I am so grateful, Ethan. I can't pay you, but I want you to know that you have given me a joy I thought I would never have again." Ethan looked at her, her eyes sparkling but warm. He just smiled and said, "Don't worry, Mrs. Rose. Sometimes helping someone makes me happy." As the house neared completion, Rose began to spend more time in the garden, watering the long untended wildflower beds. Every time Ethan saw her standing in the middle of the small garden, he felt the beauty of resilience and simple joy. On the last day, when he finished installing the last window, Rose hugged him tightly and said, "Son, you are a gift from God." Ethan smiled wryly, his rough hands lightly touching her shoulders. Little did he know that she had given him more than he could have realized at that moment. Ethan left Rose's house one late autumn afternoon. The work was done, the old house now had a new look. Rose stood on the steps, her eyes sparkling with emotion. "You did more than I expected, Ethan. Thank you." "No problem, Grandma. I was just happy to help." Ethan smiled, though he was worried about the bills and debts that still awaited him. After leaving, Ethan returned to his old routine, taking odd jobs from families around town, fixing small things, trying to scrape together a few pennies to make ends meet. But winter came early that year. Work dwindled, and Ethan had to sell some of his belongings to pay his bills. 3 months had passed since Ethan had finished Rose's house. He had not seen her since that last time. One morning, as the pale sunlight streamed through the window, Ethan received a strange letter. The envelope was thick, and it bore the seal of a law firm. He frowned, his heart filled with worry. Who would send him a lawyer's letter? He opened the letter with trembling hands. "Dear Ethan Carter, I am Jacob Wilson, the attorney representing Mrs. Rose Harding. I would like you to come to our office tomorrow to discuss some important matters regarding Mrs. Rose's will." Ethan froze, his heart stopping. Mrs. Rose? The will? His first thought was that he had done something wrong while making the repairs. He even imagined being sued for some unintentional mistake. But no matter how worried he was, he couldn't refuse the request. The next day, Ethan arrived at the law office nervously. The office was small and tidy, with soft yellow lighting. A middle-aged man with gray hair walked up and shook his hand. "You are Ethan Carter? Please come in." Ethan sat down in the chair opposite, his hands clutching the lapels, his heart pounding as Mr. Jacob opened the file. "Mr. Ethan, before she passed away, Mrs. Rose asked us to carry out her last wishes," Mr. Jacob began, his voice warm but stern. "We regret to inform you, but Mrs. Rose Harding passed away a month ago due to old age and illness." Ethan was stunned. He couldn't believe it. The image of Rose standing on the steps, smiling at him, faded from his mind. "She's dead?" Ethan asked softly, his voice trembling. "Yes," Mr. Jacob nodded. "But before she passed away, she left a will. I think you should hear it." Ethan looked at the lawyer with a puzzled look. A thought crossed his mind. Why would she mention me in the will? Mr. Jacob opened the document, took out a handwritten letter, and handed it to Ethan. "These are her last words to you?" Letter. Ethan opened the letter. Each neat and emotional word appeared before his eyes, each with enormous amounts of guilt. "Dear Ethan, you came to me when I thought I had lost all hope. When you repaired this house, you also repaired my old heart. I know you have not received anything from me, but your kindness is the most precious thing I have ever received. This house and the money I have saved all my life no longer mean anything to me. I leave it all to you, the son I never had. Live a good life, Ethan. Never stop giving. because miracles will always come back to you." Ethan's eyes blurred with the words. Tears silently rolled down his cheeks as he finished reading the letter. Mr. Jacob continued, "Mrs. Rose left you this entire house and a considerable amount of savings. We will assist you in completing all the legal procedures." Rose responded. Ethan was speechless. He looked down at the letter, each word etched into his heart. He never thought that a small act, a kindness from his heart, could bring about such a miracle. "Thank you, Mrs. Rose," Ethan whispered, his heart filled with emotion. He wiped away the tears and looked up at the sky through the window. Somewhere he believed Mrs. Rose was smiling at him, like the day they first met. After completing all the legal formalities, Ethan stood in front of Mrs. Rose's old house, now his home. The roof had been firmly repaired. The walls were freshly painted, symbolizing a new beginning. Ethan walked slowly through each room, feeling the warmth of the house and the memory of the lonely but kind old woman. With the money Rose left behind, Ethan no longer had to worry about bills or unstable employment. He redecorated the house to make it a warm space filled with memories and happiness. In the living room, he placed an old armchair that Rose used to sit in, as a way to remember the person who changed his life forever. But what was even more remarkable was that Ethan didn't keep this miracle to himself. Rose's kindness had inspired him. Over the next few weeks, Ethan decided to use some of the money to help those in need in the small town. He fixed leaky roofs, broken plumbing, and rickety fences for families who couldn't afford it, just like he had done for Rose. One day, while he was repairing a rotten wooden wall for a young family, the mother tearfully said to him, "You are the kindest person we have ever met. Why are you doing this for free?" Ethan smiled, looked up at the clear blue sky, and replied, "Because someone did this for me, and I will continue to spread the good word." Rose's house was now not only a home for Ethan, but also a symbol of kindness in the town. He devoted a small corner of the garden to growing flowers, the wildflowers that Rose loved. Every afternoon, Ethan would sit on the steps, looking at the garden and whispering to the wind, "Rose, I hope you are satisfied. I will not let you down." Ethan's story spread throughout town, becoming a testament to the power of kindness. And though Rose is gone, her presence lives on in his heart and in the good he does for others. Final message. Today's story is proof that kindness always has the power to change lives, not only of the receiver, but also of the giver. You will never know what miracles a small act of kindness can bring. If you find this story meaningful, don't forget to share and spread it to everyone around you. Click like, subscribe, and follow Kindness Stories to discover more warm stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.